I'm Phyllis Macfarlane. I'm a market researcher, and I have recently discovered history. I probably should have done history when I at A level, but I did maths instead by mistake. But all things come round, and my mother wanted me to be a teacher, and I didn't want to be a teacher, and now I love being involved with education. I'm quite obsessive about the archive of market and social research, and I hope to interest you into it and get you using it just as Stella does. We're very proud of Stella. We're always sending her new alcohol reports. She probably gets fed up with it, but we keep discovering them. Send them to Stella, we say. So I'm not moving on. There we are. What I'm going to try and do today, apart from, actually Stella's done quite a very good job for me in showing how marketing was used to sell products to women in the 1970s. My objective is to describe to you how businesses used research, but also how you can use research in your research to expand from what you might be able to get from Masov's and other archives. So I'm going to spend a little time explaining the history of the archive and what it contains and how it complements the Masov's archive, though I think Stella's done a good job. I'm going to do 3 case studies. I've actually got 5, but I thought I'd leave them in the deck for if you want to read them later. I'm going to do teenagers, attitudes to cleaning, and men's grooming. And then I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about our plans for the future, who uses the archive, and what we're doing for A-level students. So a brief history. We were established in 2016, so we're relatively young in archive terms, but we're looking forward to getting older. It took us about 5 years to gather together. All our object is to preserve all the historic market research and make them accessible for future generations. It's mainly digital, apart from the books. It's a volunteer organisation, and my committee's remit is to collect and curate content to be of value to future generations of social historians, and to develop usage. And I'm hoping that if you're not a user already, after today, you might think of doing it. And we're complementary to Masov's, as Stella said. Masov's is very much about individuals' lives, and AMSR is more of a summary about how typical people or groups of people behave. So just to take an example, I'm going to talk about teenagers in the 70s. So if you were in the Bolton bit of the Masovs, I'm from Bolton, so I'm very fond of Bolton, and you found the diary of a couple of teenagers and you were studying them, and you wanted to sort of see how the bigger mass of teenagers in the UK worked, then you could come to us and you'll find a study on more teenagers and how they behaved and how they thought and all that. So you get context, I think, is what I'm saying. And so, as I say, let's get on to teenagers. Now, I've chosen this as a subject, because it's quite funny. And it's based on one of my favourite reports, which is a CRAM, which is a Peter Cooper report called The Teenage Enigma, and there's the link if you need it. And this is a major report. It's actually 100 pages long. It's done by serious psychologists. They interviewed 20 girls in depth, and by interviewing I mean it was more of an ethnography. They interviewed them and they talked about the magazines they read and their boyfriends for quite a long time, and sort of knowing that teenagers don't always know what they think. They also interviewed their peers and their siblings and sometimes their mothers and sometimes teachers, and they did some group discussions. So it's a really rounded picture, I think, of teenagers in the 70s, and I hope to get you a little bit about it. But I knew I had to put some pictures in. I'm a person of words, so I looked for some pictures, and I found this one of school uniform in the 1970s in Wigan, which is not that far off Bolton, and I did laugh at the length of the skirts, but you've already been appropriated that. But I thought they looked a little bit young. I mean, they're what, 12, 13, aren't they? They're not really serious teenagers. So I asked AI for an older picture, and it produced this rather very pretty picture of some very pretty girls. Whether they're really 70s girls or not, I don't know, but we can pretend they are. They're a bit more, they're a bit smoother. I think that looking at those pictures in pubs, people were a lot more dishevelled, weren't they? It passed in the past. So basically, what the report says is that teenage girls were publicly sophisticated. Now, that's interesting, that word sophisticated. Remember how often Stella used it. It was an aspiration to be sophisticated. It's in that time. It isn't now. I don't think people go around saying, I want to be sophisticated. Anyway, they're privately insecure. They're treated like as adults and exposed to all sorts of sexual things and media and too much choice, but actually they're emotionally younger than the freedoms they're expected to handle. So they're treated as adults, bombarded with information. They feel a need for rules and guidance. And the paradox is they have freedom without preparation and choice without confidence. So in this case, the study was done for Boots, very serious study. Boots are trying to understand a customer who looked grown up, but still needed reassurance and guidance, which was interesting. And the new teenage mood in the 70s, the psychologist says, was passive, practical, and searching. They were overexposed to adult themes. They retreat into fantasy, romance, another word that you hear a lot in the 70s and the 60s and 70s, and pop culture. Practicality is the sort of way in which they cope with this changing world. And very interesting comment by the psychiatrist was, it seemed that the age of the teenagers got younger. And girls are teenagers from, it's contracted, girls are teenagers from 12 to 15. After that, they suddenly turn into their mothers and they become old before their time. And I'll come on to a little bit about why that, what the cultural pressures that are making them do that. But let's first of all just look at mothers and daughters. The report, as I said, they interviewed mothers. The report's full of mothers who are themselves struggling with the new freedoms. They want to be modern and permissive, but also protective, moral, and authoritative. I mean, I'd grown up by the 70s. My mother was moral and authoritative. She certainly wasn't modern and permissive. The research shows mothers are envious, anxious, conflicted. They want to be friends rather than authoritarian and projecting their own fears. So another paradox, women torn between modernity and tradition, freedom and care, work and care, convenience and competence. And their daughters, it seems, are absorbing some of these contradictions in their mothers, and they tend to imitate their mothers' aspirations, anxieties, and coping strategies. So what they said in the report was they argued that the rebel teenager had disappeared. Now, I think the 60s is generally exaggerated. They tend to say if you can remember it, you weren't there. And I've got plenty of people who worked and lived through the 60s and missed all that Mad Men sort of thing. But the media had invented the rebel teenager, and there were plenty of them. But by the mid-70s, girls were less rebellious and more passive, more conservative than adults. They were hungry for rules, and they were using pop culture not to rebel, but prepare for adulthood. And this was seen as a profound generational shift in perception, but they were only in the 70s, so whatever. But teenagers were reacting to change rather than driving it. And I thought that these quite amused me, some of these verbatims. I think sex is something for when you love somebody. If you're bounced into bed by everybody, you wouldn't have respect from the boys. I think it's all right if you love each other. She's not critical of girls who go with more than one boy, but she stays away from them because being an easy lay is not a good thing. And it seems that to some extent, sex has been disassociated from love and romance. And I love this one. One teacher remarked wryly, even the most promiscuous girls are romantic about marriage. And you have to remember, I mean, the pill was only really came about in the mid 60s. So obviously it's having an effect now in the, in the 60s. Society was much more restrictive because the fear of getting pregnant was extremely high, and the social condemnation if you got pregnant was extremely high. But it seems to have led to a lot of confusion over sex and marriage and what it was all about. I thought this, and the reason for all of this, of course, is that young women still expected to become wives and mother. Society expected them to become wives and mothers, and they still expected to become wives and mothers. And that's why you had that comment about the teenage menopause, because by 17, girls were anticipating being engaged and married. They were started saving for their first home and things like that. And their general aspirations were determinedly traditional. They expected to be married by 22, 23. I mean, you were literally on the shelf and very worried if you weren't married by 25. I had friends who really got a bit panicky if they weren't engaged at 25. They expected to have 2 to 3 children. They expected to have jobs that were compatible with motherhood, and careers were generally seen as temporary or secondary to male jobs. They didn't see themselves at all as career women. Basically, they were reenacting the parental pattern. So legal equality had arrived with the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination, but cultural equality had not. And so businesses saw an opportunity in this gap because they saw cosmetics were a preparation for adult femininity. Skincare was a responsibility to keep yourself female and young. Perfume was romance and intimacy, and fashion was a route to confidence and social acceptance. You remember, I mean, I read one girl in this study. She had 40 pence pocket money. I think she was 15. She had 40 pence pocket money. I know it's old pence, and there's been a lot of inflation since, but it wasn't a lot. Her grandmother sometimes gave her an extra 20 pence, and sometimes she earned 75 pence babysitting. And what did she do? She went to the chemist and bought tiny bottles of different coloured nail varnish or little samples of this and the other. And this, of course, was an opportunity for them, but she wanted to experiment. But of course, the commercial world was actually reinforcing the cultural norms that we were legislating desperately to try to dismantle. So it's interesting to see that things moving along, I think, a stellar thing, at different paces. And sometimes adverts move things along, sometimes the legislation moves things along. It takes time for people to catch up. So basically, the advice to Boots, having done all this research, is, how do you serve a customer who wants to be a peer adult but is still a child, still feels a child? And I won't go through all of this, but small packs, playful colours, low risk experimentation, and girls want romance and safety. And this idea of cool, calm, collected sophistication. There was this idea that if only you could be sophisticated, you would be grown up. And there was envy of sophisticated girls. And Boots was advised to be positioning themselves as an auntie, not an older sister. And you can see it's all really quite charming. Of course, number 17 came out of all this. They trained shop assistants to be more friendly because lots of the girls said how the shop assistants were a bit hard on them sometimes, and if they picked things up, they were snatched back. And it really was a useful report. I do advise, if you're interested at all in 1970s teenagers, it is well worth a read, and it's quite funny. So I chose this second one, which is based on a number of qualitative reports in the archive, because it is from 1964. the first one is from 1964, and we're stronger really on the 70s and late 60s rather than the early 50s and 60s. And we had a really good report from 1964. And we like to do stories in the archive on whatever happened which appeals to people's nostalgia. I hope none of you are so young that you don't remember Vim and Ajax. But they were basically scouring powders, and they scoured. They took the surfaces off things, and they were competitors. Vim had been launched in the early 1900s by Unilever, or Lever Brothers as it was then, but Ajax was a slightly sexier, younger Colgate Palmolive brand that was launched in the late 40s, I think, by Colgate Palmolive. And basically the 50s and 60s was the golden age of scouring powders. Everybody had either Vim or Ajax. They symbolized proper cleaning, visible effort, visible results. They were strong and honest. They matched the post-war ethic of elbow grease and moral virtue. Vim was strong and honest, and Ajax was modest and clever. So traditional housewives used Vim, modern housewives used Ajax. I personally thought they were both the same, but I'm obviously wrong. And I like this quote: "I do housework because I'm proud of my home, and I want it at all times fit to receive callers. My son often brings his pals home of an evening. I wouldn't like them to get the wrong impression." You know, that's a very thing of its time, isn't it? I mean, when my mother cleaned a room, we weren't allowed in it for several days because in case we spoiled it. She was so proud of it. And we all have sponge mops now. More than in this study, 1964, more than 60% of the sample didn't have sponge mops for cleaning the floors of the kitchen and bathroom because they didn't feel they did a good enough job. They didn't get in the corners. They sometimes left those arcs of cleaning and whatever. They preferred to get down on their hands and knees and use elbow grease and things. I think it's just absolutely marvelous. So the emotional things, one of the things that a lot of women commented on was how fortunate they were compared with their mother in the 50s, who hadn't had all these wonderful new products like Flash, and Square Deal Surf was another favourite. And they had less labour-saving devices to help them. Most housewives were more worried about keeping the house clean and tidy in case their mothers turned up, or their mother-in-law, because they definitely didn't want to be thought a slut. Definitely that was not what a good housewife did. And although they liked these modern and convenient products, they still had this vaguely guilty feeling that no ingredient can perform the same function as elbow grease. Elbow grease is the thing that really cleans. And they were stuck in this 50s. Remember, the government encouraged women to go back to the home and scrub their front doorsteps after the war because they wanted to get them out of the factories. They didn't want them to have jobs. I have my mother's letter of redundancy in 1947 telling her she was no longer needed because the men were coming back. So women had been encouraged to be guilty if it wasn't clean. And powders were seen as good because they worked. They reassured you that you'd done the job properly. They aligned with your mother's and grandmother's standards. They protected you from judgment. Whereas cream cleaners felt like cheating. They were too easy. They wanted faster cleaning, but they also wanted everybody to believe they'd scrubbed for hours. It's funny, isn't it? These things. And I tried to find a picture of a hardworking housewife, but I think I found a picture of a sluttish housewife, and she's making too much mess, really, and got too many dirty dishes to be a good housewife. But I think she's from the right period. The other thing, of course, that happened at that time that is worth mentioning, because it has a lot of ongoing effects, is that germs they weren't invented, but science started telling us about germs. And of course, manufacturers, businesses picked up on this because they could make germs the enemy and make women responsible and give them the moral duty of getting rid of germs. And again, the quotes, in those days, the woman, meaning in the 50s, one thought in more in terms of dirt than germs. Only lately has advertising made us more germ conscious. Or, and this one, when you put a baby on the floor, you have to know it's not covered with germs. I mean, that's really advertising working and frightening women. And I like this comment where women weren't just cleaning, they were running a one-woman public health service. And you know, I've done some work on Lucasade, and Lucasade, you'll remember, was aimed at sick children. And by the mid-late 70s, Lucasade sales were falling because children were getting less sick. So, I mean, I know we all had measles and mumps and had to stay in bed, but the classic thing was children would get poorly and would be put into bed for a few days and given their Lucasade. And it was lessening because of hygiene and because vaccinations obviously made a difference. But, you know, this government or campaign or whatever, it did have its uses and it did well. So what happened? The death of elbow grease. Cream cleaners came in. Cream, polished, ease, speed, and no scratching, because people were updating their houses. They had acrylic baths. They didn't want scratches all over their new baths or their new services. Younger women embraced them. They have jobs, kids, no time. Older women distrust them, but I think it's if it doesn't scratch, it doesn't clean. I think it's the function of older women to drink Guinness and be disapproving. So powders lose ground as convenience becomes more aspirational. Women want more time, and women's changing roles from housebound to time poor. So whatever happened, Vim and Ajax disappeared. They no longer met the needs. Women had less time for heavy cleaning. They wanted more scientific products. Teenagers certainly were not interested in following their mother's example. Powders felt old-fashioned and they failed to reposition. But I think that what it reveals is basically the feminists made convenience not a sin, but a good thing. And the emotional labor of cleaning, it was unsustainable. I mean, you know, it wasn't reasonable to expect women to do so much cleaning. Women once said, there you are, whatever happened to Vim and Ajax, Jif and Sif. Now then, I don't know how many minutes I've been. Does somebody want to show me a yellow card? I've just got a quick one now. This is taken from another presentation I do. So we're talking about men and grooming, and we covered in the archive, you'll find studies covering all sorts of things. Hair care. So this is the old man, Dennis Crompton, 1950s man, Lote, that beautiful parting and the beautifully held in place hair. He was the Brill Cream man of the 1950s, and the 70s man, sorry, here's the 70s man, the Bee Gees, with lots of hair. which is quite funny. So the new man was rebelling. Boys were rebelling against their fathers. Army, war experience, short back and sides, keeping yourself tidy. Real men didn't worry about their hair. So here's a quote. 10 years ago, men using hairspray were looked at as effeminate. But that's changed now. And effeminate, believe me, was not the word used. And if you're too young to be able to imagine what word was used, then you'll have to contact me afterwards and I will tell you. We don't do any eradication in the archive, but I would do on presentations. And then an advert on the right. Brill Cream was struggling, of course, for it was seen as for granddads and dads. And they have a thing with sexy and not sexy. And I mean, basically, you cannot fancy these 70s men, I think, whatever age you are. Brill Cream didn't, I mean, I know it still exists. They had a campaign called Just a Dab, apparently, so that you didn't use quite so much. You used it to control your hair, but it still exists, but it's a bit retro now. And I think the last thing we looked at was perfume and aftershave, and Old Spice and Brut are the ones you probably remember. Um, the manufacturers persisted on selling through either the wives, Old Spice, a gift for cleaning firm, or Heroes. And this is Henry Cooper. And he advertised Brut. I think he sat in a bath and splashed it on, is the story. But he appealed to the men, especially the old men, but not to the wives. There is a quote in the research which says, I went to pick up a bottle of Brut for Christmas for him, and I picked it up and I saw Henry Cooper and I put it down again. It's a shame. He's a lovely man, Henry Cooper, but he didn't appeal. But one of the lessons of all of this, and this is from a deodorant study, um, that women come to the market. So when women are ready to buy deodorant, they already have a built-in anxiety about perspiration and odor. Notice the words, perspiration and odor. Whereas men have to be taught to be anxious about sweat and smell. Most men thought sweat and smell were really rather good and perhaps a little bit sexy. And most men didn't wear deodorant except maybe at the weekend. And they had to be made anxious, if you like, by advertising. And of course, women helped, and nylon shirts helped. You remember nylon shirts? Office work helped. They didn't want to have damp patches under their arms, did they? I mean, the cultural change pushed them to wearing deodorant, but they didn't before that. And I think those things are really quite hilarious and show how business managed to sell their product. Anyway, now I'm not going to do these next slides. Women in Work tells you about the guilt women felt through working, and then women and financial services shows how women were ignored all through the 70s by banks. It was quite clear they actually handled a lot of money, but they were thought to be incompetent, and the banks concentrated on credit cards and banking the unbanked, because of course the working class were only just being paid by direct debit rather than cash or whatever. And I would say full 20 years were lost by the bank. And the first women's bank was actually in the US, but the British banks were 2 decades behind. And if building societies had done it, they could have overtaken the banks when deregulation came. It's a very interesting case study. But anyway, I'm running out of time. So going to the future, we're going to build the collection. We're collecting more and more. I mean, it's amazing. You'd think it had run out, but it turns up every week. We get more and more heritage material. We're collecting material from modern agencies so that you've got up-to-date data, because it's always interesting to see the trend. And of course, we're developing usage by marketing to historians, other academics and school children. I think Stella's given you a great idea of how you can use it, but there's a lot of historic data on products and brands, on research methods if you're a sociologist, case studies, lots of reviews of topics, academic papers, media collections on the BBC. I'm thinking the next story we're thinking of doing is whatever happened to the Radio Times. Do you know it? This is for a pub quiz if you ever. The most read publication in 1956 was the Radio Times. Incredible, isn't it? Anyway, we've updated our portal, and now it's much more friendly to specific audiences. So this is the home page. So it targets you to where we've got content for you. And if you not managed to show on this, but there is an in-depth essays part at the bottom, which is for more serious academics. And these are shorter stories, which are sort of to give you a clue on what sort of things we have in the thing. And if you go into the schools page, we're doing a lot of work with the curriculum for A-level. for modern British history, also politics, sociologists, media studies. We've only just started on media studies, and the wonderful extended project qualifications. And each of these has curated content to help children get into the archive and get into more detailed reports to help them use it. And we're spending a lot of time on that. So thank you for listening, as we've all said. And please do contact me if you want help. I love helping people. I just get new ideas by helping people. So thank you very much.